Good morning, this is the only news marathon. My name is Vyacheslav Afutin. See further events. At night, the enemy fired at Nikopol again. The head of the district military administration, Yevhen Yevtushenko, said that none of the local residents were killed or injured. 16 high-rise buildings and private houses, a stadium, farm buildings and gas furnaces were damaged. According to the State Emergency Service, the Russians fired cluster munitions from the Uragan multiple launch rocket system. Yevhen Yevtushenko urged the locals not to approach the elements of the projectiles and to call the police immediately. 6,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian land were liberated by the armed forces since the beginning of September. President Volodymyr Zelensky said this in his evening address. He also thanked the military, which continues to advance east and south with heavy battles. This is what the front line looks like on the map now. It is updated daily by the Deep State resource. In the evening of September 12, the Ukrainian military entered Sviatohirsk in Donetsk region. This was reported in the National Guard. The video was released by National Guard soldier Vitaly Markiv. Units of the National Guard of Ukraine, the Armed Forces of Ukraine and the Territorial Defense entered the city of Sviatohirsk. Step by step, meter by meter, we free our land from the occupiers. The victory will definitely be ours. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the National Guard of Ukraine. The Ukrainian military repelled enemy attacks in populated areas. Zaitsevo, Bakhmut, Bakhmutsky, Krasnohorivka, Vodyan, Beshchimyn and Novogrigorivka. It was reported in the morning summary of the General Staff. In general, the operational situation in Donbas remains tense. The enemy is shelling the infrastructure with mortars, tanks and artillery. On Monday, 5 civilians were killed in Donbas as a result of Russian shelling. 10 others were injured. The head of Donetsk region, Pivilo Kyrylenko, reported this on Telegram. In the south of Ukraine, the front line advanced by 12 kilometers. More than 1,500 square kilometers of occupied territories were liberated. Major General of the Armed Forces of Ukraine Dmytro Marchenko told the Suspiln TV channel about this. According to him, the Ukrainian military knocked out the enemy from 13 settlements in the Kherson region. Where else did the Ukrainian army manage to strengthen itself? Suspiln asked the first deputy head of the regional council Yuri Sobolevsky. The actions of the armed forces of Ukraine, from what can be said, are successful. Actually successful. In the near future, I think, there will be an official announcement about the recapture of new settlements. Guys work for them. In some localities, they finish working, but we have to keep quiet and wait for official notifications. The armed forces of Ukraine continue to implement their successful tactics to destroy enemy logistics. In 6 days, from the 6th of September, the armed forces of Ukraine destroyed 590 units of Russian equipment. Its value is estimated at $760 million. The Russians lost most of this during the counteroffensive of the armed forces of the Kharkiv region. Forbes made the calculations with reference to open data of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In particular, Ukrainian fighters destroyed 86 tanks, 158 armored vehicles, and 106 artillery systems. According to the publication, the most expensive loss of the Russian army is the MOSKVA-1 electronic warfare complex. Its cost is $57 million. It was destroyed in the Zaporizhzhia region. In the Kharkiv region, the Russians lost the Zupart counter-battery radar system for $5 million. Also, the Su-34 fighter bomber for $6 million. More than 70,000 square kilometers in 10 regions were mined with ammunition and explosives. The General Staff reported, the defense forces are taking measures to return peaceful life to the liberated communities as soon as possible. Cleaning is ongoing in the liberated territories of Kharkiv region. There are mined areas here. It was written about in the summary of the General Staff. Law enforcement officers document the war crimes of the enemy. Humanitarian goods went to the liberated communities of the region. Oleg Sinagubov, the head of the region, wrote about it yesterday in Telegram. He also reported that the Ukrainian armed forces are continuing the operation to liberate Kharkiv Oblast from the Russian occupiers. In general, the Ukrainian flag was returned to more than 40 settlements. In some areas of the front, our defenders reached the state border with Russia. In the east, the enemy was pushed back beyond the Oskol River. In the village of Zalaznichna in Kharkiv Oblast, liberated from the invaders, the police recovered the bodies of 4 civilians with traces of torture. This was announced by the regional prosecutor's office on its Facebook page. According to Serhiy Bolvinov, head of the investigative department of the regional police, 2 people were shot in the head by the occupiers. Another man was killed by the Russians in his own house. The last body was found on the territory of the asphalt plant. Local residents reported to the police that fellow villagers were killed by the Russian military in February. At that time Zalaznichna was occupied. The bodies were sent for examination. The criminal implementation is being investigated under the article on violations of the laws and customs of war. 2 civilians were in the house behind me. They were shot in the head by the soldiers of the Russian Federation, who occupied this village and part of the Chuguyevsky district. Civilian local residents buried 2 bodies of these people on March 3. Then they turned to the police to report these terrible facts. After examining the scene, the body was exhumed together with forensic medical experts. We examined these bodies. In the house behind me, we found shell casings and bullets that were probably used to kill these civilians. Glory to Ukraine. The only news marathon continues. The team of the First Public Broadcasting Channel is on news duty. My name is Anna Cherednichenko. Traditionally, we continue to talk about the situation in the regions, about the development of the Russian-Ukrainian war. We will also talk about the situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And about our weapons, about weapons that civilians have against the Russian aggressor.
This is to donate. The money we give to charity. How are Ukrainians currently helping the army and how can this process be activated? What are the needs? We will talk about this and more during this information hour, but first, traditionally, we address the regions. How did they survive that night? What is the situation now? First of all, we will ask our correspondent Elena Lysenko from Zaporizhzhia. So, what do we have in Zaporizhzhia and the Zaporizhzhia region? Olena, hello, glory to Ukraine. What is our current situation in the region? Elena, can you hear us? Hello Anna. Glory to heroes. Yesterday, September 12, around 1 o'clock in the morning, the occupiers attacked Zaporizhzhia with 4 S-300 missiles. There were no casualties. Enemy shells hit a private enterprise on the outskirts of Zaporizhzhia and in a forest strip. The warehouse was destroyed, reports Alexander Staruk, the head of the Zaporizhzhia military administration. According to him, they probably fired from the side of Vasilivka. Also, the occupiers continue to shell the populated areas of the Zaporizhzhia region. Over the past few days, 7 points in the Pologiv and Vasiliv districts were shelled. This was reported by the Zaporizhzhia Regional Military Administration. Unfortunately, 3 people died. 1 woman with shrapnel wounds was taken to the hospital. As a result of shelling in Gorykhov and Preobrazhenskoe of Pologiv district, several houses and a boiler house in the private sector were damaged by shells. Residents of Gulyaipol and nearby villages, Ustenivka and Zalaznichna, have reported the consequences of the armed aggression of the Russian military. Shell fragments damaged more than 10 small buildings. Also, utility and garage premises, a hangar building, and agricultural machinery were destroyed. The occupiers shelled the houses of the residents of Sviatohirsk and Primorsky villages with artillery. The shock wave shattered their windows and gutted their doors. In some houses, the roofs, walls and facades were damaged by the shells. The situation remains difficult. People continue to evacuate to Zaporizhzhia. More than 1,000 people per day. Currently, most people are from the Kherson region and Energodar. Olena, is there any new information on the situation in Energodar and Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant? The last thing that was known was that on the night of September 11, around 4 o'clock in the morning, power unit number 6 was disconnected from the power grid. Preparations are currently underway for its cooling and transfer to a cold state. This was reported by the Energoatom enterprise in Telegram. The situation in Energodar is difficult. But, according to the mayor of the city, Dmitro Orlov, there have been no shelling of the city itself in the last few days. Thank you, Olena. Olena Asenko, our correspondent on the situation in Zaporizhzhia and the Zaporizhzhia region. We will return to the topic of Energodar and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. In particular, we will talk with an expert about what this transition of power units into a cold state means, and whether there are any threats here. We will talk about all this a little later, so stay tuned. For now, we will turn to the north of Ukraine. What is the situation there, in particular, on the border territory? Are they shelling the border of Chernihiv Oblast? Will there be an evacuation of people in connection with this? Our correspondent Daria Yanushkevich will tell us this. Hello, colleague. Glory to Ukraine. What is the situation on the border territory in Chernihiv region? Anya, hello. Glory to heroes. The border area of Chernihiv Oblast is shelled almost every day. Just yesterday, on September 12, shelling was recorded 6 times in the village of Mykishchina Slobodeshchina in Novgorod-Sivishchina. They fired from a self-propelled artillery installation, and 13 more explosions were recorded already in the evening. Currently, there is no information about damage to infrastructure and casualties among the population. In fact, Novgorod-Sivishchina is shelled almost every day. Only last week, people began to evacuate from the village of Khomenyuk Sloboda. There is no centralized evacuation from the military administration, because there is no agreement for it. People independently decided to leave this village. Because it is only 10 kilometers from Khomenyuk Sloboda to the border with Russia and there is significant destruction in the village. Here, houses and gardens were shelled. In fact, there are no living conditions left. By August, about 200 people lived in the village. Currently, according to the latest data from the head of the village of Khomenyuk Sloboda, there are a little more than a dozen people left to live there. Mostly, these are elderly people who have nowhere to go. And those people who have relatives in neighboring villages of the same community, they started visiting them. Likewise, people turned to the Novgorod-Sivir military administration with a request for help in finding a place to move to. In the community, they began to look for vacant houses where there are no people. People moved out and left their homes, or the houses were empty for a long time. People started moving there because the heating season is about to start and people are worried that there will be neither opportunities nor conditions to live in Khomenyuk Sloboda. Therefore, they move and the military administration helps them find housing and transport. The military, farmers and volunteers help people transport things. Everyone who has the opportunity to help. But, at the moment, there is no official evacuation from the border of Chernihiv Oblast in the Novgorod-Sivirsk community. Do you know how people who leave on their own look for a new place to live? Is there any help from the state or volunteers in the matter of finding the city of arrival? If we are talking about centralized volunteer centers, then there is no such help. People independently and collectively look for vacant houses and settle there. Some people have already moved to the village of Degtyarivka. This is in another part of the rural community. People do not move far, they stay in the community, but away from the border. They populate empty houses where there are no people. Those people who have left and do not yet plan to return, they provide their housing for use. For those people who are forced to leave the border due to constant shelling. Daria, one more question about shelling. What is the situation with communications in border communities? Is there electricity, communication, water and so on? It depends on where the projectiles hit. If the hit happened where the power grid passed, then for some time people in the villages are without electricity. But it is being restored. That is, it happens that for some time residents have to live without electricity. Of course. Daria Yanushkevich, our correspondent from Chernihiv, thank you for the information about the border areas. Let me remind you that we talked about the communities that the Russians shell regularly in Chernihiv Oblast. These are the communities that are closest to the Russian border and where enemy artillery can reach. Then we return again to the Ukrainian south. 2 control points and a radio-electronic warfare station of the Russians were destroyed by the Ukrainian military. In more detail about the situation in this area, we will ask Nataliya Khomenyuk, head of the Joint Press Center of the Southern Defense Forces. Ms. Nataliya, good morning and glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes, hello. If we talk in general about the situation in the area of responsibility of the Southern Operational Command, what is it like now? The situation is tense, steadily tense. However, the situation is controlled by the defense forces of southern Ukraine. In particular, the enemy perpetuates terrorism, remote, so to speak. It fires at peaceful, civilian settlements. Now his attention is more focused on the Kryvyi Rih Zaporizhzhia direction. The fire is being conducted in the area where the nuclear power plant is located, in particular, the Nikopol district. That night, he suffered from shelling by multiple rocket launchers and heavy artillery. Fortunately, there were no casualties or injuries, but there was destruction of civil infrastructure and residential buildings. That is, it is a method of psychological and fire pressure. In those areas where we are successful and they are unable to advance, they try to terrorize the surrounding population. The aim is, in particular, to create attitudes of distrust towards the defense forces. Filtration measures are currently taking place in the settlements that we cleared of the occupiers. Demining activities are also carried out there. Because the enemy, retreating, tried to do as much damage as possible. Everyone, in particular, volunteers, must be very careful. We are grateful to them. They immediately responded to the need to restore the humanitarian situation in these settlements. The population, which has been hiding in shelters for a long time, but now freely goes out into the streets, should also be careful. You have to be very careful. I want to ask about this. We understand that the liberation of settlements is being talked about a little later than it actually happens. You explained why, because it's a security issue. If the settlement has already been declared vacated, does that mean for the locals that they can return? Do they need to wait for special instructions in this regard? We do not give instructions in this direction. We only provide recommendations. Because it is very difficult to prevent people from returning home. If they want to return to these territories, we can only warn them of the danger. I can wait for them here. And organize your work. My own, because the military continues to work in these settlements. Organize your work so that it is as safe as possible for the local population. That is, please listen to all the recommendations provided by the units of the armed forces and the defense forces in this direction. Recommendations can come from the police or the security service of Ukraine. All these measures and restrictions are aimed at preserving life. What, for example, can be the restrictions? To understand a person who wants to return. For example, the restriction that it is still impossible to enter this quarter. People are coming back, they want to go home, and their neighborhood has not yet been demoned. You have to wait, get shelter from your neighbors if you have already arrived. There is no need to make a scandal in such a situation. All these measures are aimed only at preserving life and ensuring safety. Returning to the topic of Russian terror, which they deployed in response to their defeats. In particular, in Kharkiv region. In the Kharkiv region and in the eastern part of Ukraine, they hit the power system facilities. Are critical infrastructure facilities also under attack in the south? You understand, it can be interpreted in different ways. It is very difficult to say what is in their head. But, for example, a rocket attack on a granary in the Mykolaiv region. This is after the dictator's announcement of issues related to grain agreements. That we are not feeding those who are needed. And after that they tried to hit the granary. They explain the TSK by the fact that there could be warehouses with ammunition. Looking for logic in this behavior is futile. It is necessary to realize that the terrorist country acts with terrorist methods on the entire territory that it dreamed of capturing. But she will not succeed. Of course. We can already see it in the way they negatively attack, the way they speak. Thank you. Nataliya Khomenyuk, the head of the Joint Press Center of the Southern Security and Defense Forces, was in touch with us. We talked about the situation in the south of Ukraine. Let's return to the announced topic of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. In the near future, the occupiers may fire another attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This was reported in the Main Directorate of Intelligence. We will ask the spokesman of the Main Intelligence Directorate, Andriy Yusov, in more detail. Mr. Andriy, hello and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to heroes. Hello.
Let's talk about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. What indicates that it is worth preparing for a new armed provocation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant?
First of all, we can already talk, unfortunately, not only about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The Russian aggressor is methodically shelling the entire energy infrastructure of Ukraine. This can affect other nuclear facilities and other nuclear plants, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is already in a critical situation due to numerous Russian shelling. Indeed, there is information about certain preparations for further provocations and shelling of the Zaporizhzhia power plant. That the personnel of the aggressor has a plan. They must remain in cover during their signals. There is relocation of equipment. There is a systematic activity to damage power lines. Currently, only a few power transmission lines connecting the ZNPP with the Ukrainian power system remain. We have already seen the consequences of previous shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Not only shelling, we are talking about systemic nuclear terrorism, terror of the local population, terror of the civilian staff of the station. In fact, a terrorist state has seized a nuclear facility. Having seen a certain, let's say, impunity on the part of the international community. Now they are scaling this story to the entire energy system of Ukraine. In this way, they are preparing an outright humanitarian disaster and crisis on the eve of winter.
By the way, are there any data on new attacks deep into Ukraine? So far, we have seen the concentration of this energy terror in the northern, eastern and partly also the central region. The south has its own story.
Is there any information about the advancement of missile strikes on critical infrastructure objects deep into Ukraine? Western regions, central regions. We must understand that the enemy has the same forces and means, despite the fact that the number of high-precision weapons is decreasing. In Russia, there is no possibility of quickly replenishing these stocks. But they have a large stockpile of obsolete Soviet missiles like the Kh-22. They are launched from a strategic bomber. They can cause serious damage. If we talk about the implementation of the strategy, the latest strikes on the energy system and critical infrastructure of Ukraine. These are planned actions of the aggressor. It is quite possible to imagine other scenarios. Ukraine, for its part, is preparing for this. But this is also a challenge for the whole world. Because there is a question of how actively Ukraine should be helped in matters of air defense provision. And how actively it is necessary to put pressure on Putin's regime and block all possibilities of such terror. This is a clear violation of the norms and rules of warfare. This is a violation of humanitarian law. We are now talking about principled strikes on objects that have nothing to do with military infrastructure. Which, in fact, do not harm the military infrastructure, from which only the local population suffers. Putin wants to plunge Ukraine and all of Europe into a dark, cold winter.
They heard you. Thank you. Andriy Yusov, the spokesman of the Main Intelligence Directorate, was in touch with us. The full name is the Main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ministry of Ukraine.